Midnight, Lower Manhattan, 1967. 70 feet below the streets, an engineer named John Kyle is staring at a crack. Not a structural crack, not a hairline fracture in concrete. A gap between the slurry wall and the earth, and on the other side of that gap, 300 feet away, the Hudson River. He does not go home that night. He does not report the gap to the press. He calls his supervisor, seals the section, and by morning, the work continues. The towers will rise from this moment. The towers will fall from it. And the court records, the appraisal documents, the payroll ledgers, the sworn testimony of 800 small business owners, all of it buried so deep beneath the memorial that almost nobody goes looking. We did. This is what we found. But to understand what was buried, you first have to understand what was there before the first shovel broke ground. That story begins not in 1967, but in 1945, when an entire city started running. The war ended in August of 1945. American servicemen came home, and the corporations started leaving. It began quietly. A few Connecticut moves, a handful of Westchester relocations. Executives discovered they could trade a cramped elevator building for a glass campus with parking lots and landscaping, and save a fortune in taxes doing it. By the early 1950s, it wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. Companies that had occupied Lower Manhattan office space for decades filed change of address forms and walked out. Entire floors went dark. Property values fell year by year. The tax base that funded city services, police, sanitation, schools, eroded with them. New York, the wealthiest city in the world, was watching its financial foundation crack from the bottom up. Lower Manhattan suffered most. The neighborhood south of Chambers Street had been built for a different century. Narrow streets designed for horse-drawn carts, buildings from the 1880s, no central air conditioning, elevator cabs the size of closets, no parking, no amenities. For a business executive in 1955, the comparison was simple. That address or a suburban campus? The choice was easy. The area needed someone to save it, or at least someone to say they were saving it while doing something else entirely. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the untold stories behind America's most powerful buildings, please like and subscribe. We audit history, so you don't have to take anyone's word for it. Before we follow that man, and we will, we need to walk one specific neighborhood. 13 blocks, hundreds of storefronts, and 30,000 people whose livelihoods would be dismissed as collateral damage. Let us be specific. This is not a story about a neighborhood in decline. This is a story about a neighborhood that worked, and what happened to the people who built it. Radio Row occupied 13 blocks, bounded by Cortlandt Street to the north, Liberty Street to the south, Church Street to the east, and West Street along the waterfront. It had grown organically over 50 years, not planned, not subsidized, not developed, just built by immigrants, veterans, and working-class families who understood one thing: proximity creates value. The shops were modest, 4- and 5-story walk-ups, plate glass windows crammed with inventory, vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, wire of every gauge, surplus military electronics still carrying the smell of the Pacific Theater, radios in every state of repair. Most operations were family-owned. Many proprietors were first-generation Americans who had started with less than $1,000 and turned it into something that fed their families for decades. Nothing about the architecture suggested grandeur. Everything functioned exactly as it needed to. And here is the audit number that matters. By 1955, Radio Row businesses directly employed approximately 30,000 people. 30,000. Shop owners, skilled technicians, salespeople. delivery drivers, office staff, apprentices learning their trade on the floor. Annual sales likely reached tens of millions of dollars. Tellingly, nobody in government ever bothered to compile the exact figures. The businesses paid property taxes, they paid sales taxes and payroll taxes. At a time when tax revenues throughout the city were declining, Radio Row was contributing. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Radio Row was also a knowledge system. Before electronics engineering programs existed in most universities, this neighborhood was where people learned by doing. A teenager interested in radio technology could walk in off the street, get hired as a shop assistant. Within a year, understand more about circuit repair than most textbook graduates ever would. That knowledge was transmitted across generations through apprenticeship, the same way European craftsmen had passed down their trades for centuries. Shopkeepers possessed what no manual could replicate: decades of accumulated expertise about discontinued parts, about reliable suppliers, about what failure modes looked like in vacuum tube amplifiers from 1942. Engineers from major corporations came down to Radio Row to source parts for prototype development. Students from technical schools browsed for components on weekends. Electronics enthusiasts traveled from across the northeastern United States specifically to walk those 13 blocks. The social fabric was equally distinctive. Proprietors maintained extensive relationships with competitors. They sent customers to shops down the street when they didn't have what was needed. Information flowed freely about new products, supplier reliability, market conditions. This was not a network managed by a trade association. This was trust, built over decades, transaction by transaction. Many owners had started as employees in other Radio Row shops. They saved. They opened their own storefronts. They hired. They mentored. The community was self-sustaining, self-regulating, profitable without outside intervention. And none of it, impressed the men making decisions about New York's future. To urban planners evaluating Lower Manhattan, Radio Row represented one thing: old buildings generating modest revenues on land that could theoretically generate much larger ones. The businesses were old, the streets were congested, the buildings lacked modern amenities, the 30,000 jobs were dismissed as low value compared to the prestigious corporate employment that new development would supposedly attract. That word, supposedly, is doing a great deal of work. We will come back to it. For now, understand what was being swept aside. Not blight, not dysfunction, not a neighborhood in collapse, a community, working, profitable, irreplaceable. Completely unaware of what was being decided behind closed doors by a man who had never once worked in a shop like this in his life. That man's name was David Rockefeller, and what he saw when he looked at Radio Row was not a community. It was a blank canvas and a problem to be solved. David Rockefeller was born in 1915, the youngest son of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. By the time David came of age, the family wealth had diversified into banking, real estate holdings, and philanthropic foundations. The Rockefellers were not merely rich, they were an American institution. Their name opened doors that remained closed to even ordinary wealthy families. David studied economics at Harvard, earned a doctorate from the University of Chicago, served in military intelligence during the war. In 1946, he joined Chase National Bank. By 1960, he was chairman and chief executive of one of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. His office sat in the financial district, and here is the detail that no press release ever led with. Through family investment vehicles, David Rockefeller owned substantial real estate throughout Lower Manhattan. When property values began declining in the early 1950s, Rockefeller faced a choice. He could accept the deterioration, quietly divest, move on. Or he could attempt something far more ambitious. He could try to reverse the decline entirely through massive intervention, requiring government power on an unprecedented scale. He chose the second option, and he called it urban renewal. In 1956, Rockefeller organized the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. The name suggested a broad civic coalition. In reality, it was a private planning group, controlled by Rockefeller and a circle of major property owners whose portfolios would benefit from redevelopment, not the residents of Lower Manhattan. Not the shop owners of Radio Row, not the workers who depended on those shops. The property owners. The association hired urban planners and architects to study the district. The studies reached similar conclusions every single time. Lower Manhattan needed dramatic transformation. The existing building stock was obsolete. The street patterns were inefficient. The area lacked a signature project. Small businesses like those in Radio Row couldn't generate the rent revenues needed for expensive new construction. What the area required, according to these studies, was wholesale clearance and redevelopment. The conclusion was predetermined. The studies were written to confirm a decision already made. This is how power operates at this level. You do not announce what you want. You commission studies that discover what you want. Then you cite the studies. Rockefeller identified the mechanism he needed, the Port of New York Authority, created in 1921 as a bi-state agency jointly controlled by New York and New Jersey. Its original mandate involved transportation infrastructure. But the authority possessed extraordinary legal powers. It could condemn property through eminent domain. It could issue bonds backed by future revenues rather than taxpayer guarantees. It was exempt from local zoning regulations. And crucially, it answered to governors. Not city councils, not mayors. In 1960, David Rockefeller's brother Nelson was serving as governor of New York. Read that sentence again. The man who needed Lower Manhattan redeveloped had a brother controlling the political mechanism that could force it. The Rockefeller family now controlled both the vision for transformation and a significant portion of the political power to execute it. Austin Tobin served as executive director of the Port Authority. He had built the agency into a powerful, quasi-governmental corporation. Tobin understood something fundamental. Organizations either grow or they die. By 1960, the Port Authority's traditional construction projects were complete: the George Washington Bridge, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, port facilities in both states. Without new projects, the authority risked becoming irrelevant. Political influence would erode. Talented engineers would leave. The World Trade Center proposal offered Tobin exactly what he needed: a massive construction project, years of employment for Port Authority staff, a prominent development that would enhance the agency's prestige, a financial structure that could theoretically pay for itself. Rockefeller and Tobin began serious private discussions in 1960. No public announcement, no community input, no notification to the 30,000 people whose livelihoods were on the agenda. The two men shared an understanding about how large projects happen. You developed the complete plan first, then you presented it to the public as inevitable. Soliciting input early only created opportunities for opposition to organize. By 1961, the basic concept was settled. The Port Authority would build a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. TwinTowers would serve as the signature elements, tall enough to reclaim the title of world's tallest buildings from the Empire State Building. The initial cost estimate, $280 million, roughly $2.8 billion in today's money. Every dollar of that would be borrowed against the bridge and tunnel tolls paid by working commuters crossing the Hudson every morning. Commuters who had no vote on this. Commuters who were never asked. The site selection came next. Several locations in Lower Manhattan were evaluated, but Radio Row kept appearing as the optimal choice. The real estate was cheap. The businesses were small and fragmented, meaning no single powerful opponent controlled large parcels. The location adjacent to the Hudson offered spectacular views. Most importantly, Radio Row could be characterized as blighted. This designation was not a description of reality. It was a legal tool, and the man holding that tool was about to use it. The word blight sounds technical, neutral, official. It is none of those things, and the court records from 1963 tell us exactly what it really was. Let us open the file. January 28, 1960. The Port Authority and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association held a joint press conference. They unveiled plans for a World Trade Center to be built on a site bounded by Vesey Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Anyone who lived or worked in that neighborhood recognized those streets immediately. That was Radio Row. Press coverage was, by and large, favorable. The New York Times praised the ambition. Editorial pages celebrated the vision of modern towers replacing what they called decaying blocks. Business sections predicted thousands of construction jobs and millions in tax revenue. The narrative was progress, modernization, urban renewal. These were the 1960s. Old things made way for new things. That was how cities evolved. Buried in the coverage were brief mentions of displaced businesses. The Times noted approximately 800 small shops occupied the site. The number of jobs was reported as several thousand. The general tone suggested these were unfortunate casualties of necessary progress. The Radio Row business owners learned about the plan from newspapers. No one from the Port Authority had contacted them. No advance notice had been provided. The first indication that their life's work was scheduled for demolition came from reading the morning paper. Now, here is where we open the court record. The legal mechanism the Port Authority used was eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use. Eminent domain is constitutional, but it requires two things. First, the taking must serve a genuine public purpose. Second, compensation must be fair and just. The Port Authority claimed both. The studies commissioned by the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had labeled Radio Row blighted. Blighted areas could be cleared in the public interest. That was the theory. But the 1963 court records reveal something the press releases did not mention. The definition of blight used in those studies was elastic, deliberately so. It required no physical evidence of structural failure. It required no documented safety hazard. It could simply mean that planners had decided the current use was not the highest and best use of the land. In other words, your building is not broken. Your business is not failing. But someone more powerful than you has decided something more profitable could be built here. Therefore, you are blighted. Radio Row buildings were old. That was undeniable. Many dated from the late 19th century. They lacked central air conditioning. Elevators were small. But old for office towers did not mean old for electronics retail and repair. The businesses in Radio Row didn't need marble lobbies. They needed affordable rent and proximity to each other. The informal clustering that made Radio Row valuable was impossible to recreate in a modern office building. Rents would be 10 or 20 times higher. The business model would collapse overnight. The blight designation ignored this distinction entirely. The studies commissioned by Rockefeller's own organization focused on what the buildings lacked, not on whether those lacks mattered to the people actually using them. The conclusion was written before the analysis. Radio Row was blighted. Therefore, clearing it served the public interest. Therefore, eminent domain was justified. Business owners had no warning this was coming. Oscar Nadell owned a radio parts shop on Cortlandt Street. He had operated there for more than 30 years. His father had started the business. Nadell had inherited it, expanded, raised a family on it. He read the announcement with growing disbelief. His building was scheduled for demolition. His business would be forced to relocate. Compensation would be based on appraisals conducted by the Port Authority, the same organization that wanted to take his property. He called other business owners, Everyone had the same questions. Could the Port Authority actually do this? What were their rights? Could they fight the condemnation? They formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association. Nadell became spokesman. They pooled money. They hired lawyers. The lawyers reviewed the Port Authority's powers and delivered discouraging news. The agency had broad authority. Courts historically deferred to government claims that projects served public interests. The blight designation, however questionable, would be difficult to challenge. But the lawyers found potential vulnerabilities. The Port Authority's original mandate involved transportation infrastructure, not office building development. Could an agency chartered to build bridges and tunnels legally claim that luxury office towers constituted a public purpose? Did housing, international trade organizations justify seizing private property from American small business owners? The business owners filed suit in 1962. The case reached the New York Court of Appeals. In March of 1963, the court ruled in favor of the Port Authority. The judges accepted the agency's argument that promoting international trade served a legitimate public interest. The blight designation was not seriously challenged. The business owner's fundamental objection that the government was taking private property to benefit other private interests was dismissed. Now, here is what that ruling did not address. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, the organization that commissioned the blight studies, was controlled by Rockefeller. The Port Authority's expansion was endorsed by Governor Rockefeller. The financial beneficiary of rising property values in the surrounding blocks was David Rockefeller's personal real estate portfolio. The court record contains none of this. It was not presented. It was not argued. It was not relevant to the narrow legal question of whether the Port Authority possessed the power to condemn the property. It possessed that power, full stop. Whether that power should have been exercised in service of one family's investment interests, that question was never before the court. It was never before anyone. The appraisal process began immediately after the ruling. Port Authority assessors toured Radio Row properties. They calculated values based on structures, land, and projected business income. The methodology was systematically inadequate. A building purchased decades earlier for $20,000 might be appraised at $30,000. Some land appreciation, but no adjustment for inflation, replacement costs, or the value of the business itself. Business goodwill. The intangible value of 30 years of customer relationships was given minimal weight. The cost of relocating inventory, finding new space, rebuilding clientele, barely considered. Oscar Nadell's shop was appraised at a fraction of what he believed it was worth. He knew the number was absurd. His business generated enough income to support his family and his employees. Moving it would cost far more than the compensation offered. Starting over at 60 years old was not a realistic option. He was not the only one. Hundreds of other owners received similar assessments. The compensation was inadequate. The timeline was compressed. They would be forced to sell and vacate within months. The Port Authority had won in court. The financial terms had been set in their favor. The neighborhood had perhaps 5 years before the wrecking crews arrived. The shops remained open. Customers still came. But everyone understood that Radio Row was living on borrowed time. The Rockefellers had made their decision in a private meeting years before any of this was announced. Everything that followed, the studies, the hearings, the lawsuits, the appraisals, was procedure. It was the performance of process, not the process itself. But some of those shop owners refused to accept that performance. They organized, they made noise, and for a brief moment, the press listened. The morning after the announcement, Oscar Nadell called 11 people. By the end of that week, reporters were walking through Radio Row, through the actual streets, past open storefronts, past customers who had no idea their neighborhood was already scheduled for demolition. Not a rendering, not a press release, the real thing. Journalists saw functioning stores filled with customers, not blighted decay. Not structural hazard. Shops. Open. People buying things. They interviewed proprietors who described building their businesses over decades. The narrative in the papers began to shift. Maybe this wasn't simply progress replacing obsolescence. Maybe this was powerful interests destroying a viable community for private gain. The Port Authority responded by accelerating its timeline. Delays gave opposition time to build political support. Tobin pushed for quick approval from the Port Authority Board, rapid property appraisals, immediate condemnation proceedings. The faster the process moved, the less opportunity existed for effective resistance. By 1962, the battle lines were clear. The Port Authority and Rockefeller interests had power, money, and political connections. The Radio Row business owners had justice on their side, but little else. They could file lawsuits, hold press conferences, appeal to elected officials. But they could not stop the Port Authority from issuing bonds, could not prevent the board from voting approval, could not overcome the legal doctrine that eminent domain for public purposes was constitutional. The March 1963 court ruling ended the legal fight. By 1964, some owners began accepting settlements. Legal avenues were exhausted. Continued resistance would only mean losing their businesses with even less compensation. The first shops began closing. Going out of business sales liquidated decades of accumulated inventory. Proprietors were reduced to selling at pennies on the dollar. The community started fragmenting. Some owners relocated to other parts of the city, but the electronics cluster that made Radio Row valuable could not be recreated elsewhere. Shops scattered across different neighborhoods lost the advantage of proximity. Customers who could once walk from store to store now had to travel across the city. The ecosystem was being destroyed. Other owners simply retired. They took the inadequate compensation and gave up, finding new locations, negotiating new leases, rebuilding clientele. The effort seemed insurmountable for proprietors who had already invested 30 or 40 years. A few refused to leave. They rejected settlements. They forced the Port Authority to pursue formal condemnation proceedings. These owners knew they would ultimately lose, but they wanted to impose maximum cost and delay on the project. If they couldn't save Radio Row, they could at least make Rockefeller and Tobin pay for destroying it. The wrecking crews arrived in March of 1966. Demolition began on the east side of the district, working systematically westward toward the Hudson. The first buildings to fall were the smallest and oldest. Crews broke through roofs, knocked down walls, hauled away debris. Buildings that had stood for 70 or 80 years disappeared in days. Shop owners who had already vacated watched from across the street. Some came to witness the destruction of places where they had spent decades. Others stayed away, unable to bear seeing it. The photographs from that spring show men in suits standing on sidewalks, staring at piles of brick and splintered wood that had been their businesses. Not everyone had left. A handful of proprietors refused to acknowledge the condemnation orders. They remained in their shops, serving customers, maintaining the fiction that normal business could continue. The Port Authority obtained court orders authorizing physical removal. City marshals arrived with eviction notices. The holdouts were escorted from their buildings. Their possessions moved to the street. Oscar Nadell was among the last to go. He had operated his radio shop for 33 years. Every component on his shelves represented accumulated knowledge about suppliers, about manufacturers, about what his customers needed. On a morning in April of 1966, marshals knocked on his door and told him he had 2 hours to remove what he could carry. Nadell filled boxes with inventory. He left most of it behind. There was no time, no place to store everything. The business he had inherited from his father and built into something sustainable was reduced to whatever fit in his car. He drove away as demolition crews prepared to tear down the building. Within a week, the structure was rubble. The human cost extended beyond the 800 business owners. Each shop had employed people: technicians, salespeople, delivery drivers, office staff. Conservative estimates: 30,000 jobs directly tied to Radio Row. The Port Authority paid settlements to property owners and primary business operators. Workers who had spent years or decades in Radio Row shops received nothing. They lost their jobs when their employers were forced out. They had to find work in an economy already shedding manufacturing and technical positions. Mortgages couldn't be paid. Education plans for children were disrupted. Retirements were delayed or abandoned. The African American and immigrant communities that had found economic footing through Radio Row were hit particularly hard. The neighborhood had been one of the few places in that era where technical skill mattered more than surname or skin color. That latter was removed. The media coverage dwindled. Early stories about the David versus Goliath legal battle gave way to construction updates. Radio Row was becoming history. The World Trade Center was the future. The record shows no farewell ceremony, no official acknowledgement, no moment where the city paused to mark what had been lost. And waiting in the wings was an architect who had deeply personal reasons to refuse the commission, and accepted it anyway. Minoru Yamasaki accepted the World Trade Center Commission in 1962. He was the most prominent Japanese-American architect in the country. What the Port Authority asked him to build would test everything he believed. The choice carried layers of irony that apparently escaped notice at the time. Yamasaki was a Japanese-American who had spent part of World War II affected by internment policies. Now he was being asked to design the ultimate symbol of American capitalist triumph on land seized from small business owners through government force. He was born in Seattle in 1912 to immigrant parents who ran a small business. He studied architecture at the University of Washington, supporting himself through part-time work. After graduation, he moved to New York, found employment with various firms, worked his way up through talent and persistence despite the discrimination Japanese Americans faced in professional settings. When war came, Executive Order 9066 authorized the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Yamasaki's family was sent to camps. He avoided internment only because he was already living in New York, but the experience marked him profoundly. He had watched his parents lose everything they had built because the government decided their presence was inconvenient. Let that sit for a moment. The man asked to build the World Trade Center had watched his family be dispossessed by government power. He was being asked to design a monument built through that same mechanism, on land taken from people who had built something from nothing and had it seized. By the early 1960s, Yamasaki had established himself as a significant architect. His designs emphasized light, openness, and human scale. He believed buildings should inspire and comfort their occupants, not overwhelm them. His buildings featured delicate details, natural materials, and careful attention to how people would actually use spaces. The World Trade Center Commission required him to abandon most of these principles. The program was predetermined. 2 towers, 110 stories each, floor plates large enough for massive office layouts, exterior walls that would support the structural load, eliminating the need for interior columns. The scale contradicted everything Yamasaki believed about humane architecture. He accepted the commission anyway. The reason was simple. This was the largest architectural project in the world. Turning it down would have been professional suicide. Every architect made compromises. This was simply a larger compromise for a larger fee. Now, let us talk about what it was actually like to be inside the towers, because this is the tour the promotional materials never provided. The structural solution was a tube of closely spaced exterior aluminum columns. Each column was 18 inches wide. They were positioned just 22 inches apart. The narrow window spacing was primarily an engineering necessity, but Yamasaki claimed it also served a psychological purpose. He was, by multiple accounts, afraid of heights. The closely spaced columns made the windows feel smaller, less vertiginous to the person standing at the glass. The windows themselves could not open. This was standard for modern climate-controlled towers. But the consequence was total. Occupants had no fresh air, no control over their immediate environment. They worked in hermetically sealed boxes, entirely dependent on mechanical systems for comfort and survival. If the air handling system failed, the air quality degraded. If the heating system failed, the temperature shifted. If the elevators stopped, 50,000 people per tower had no way to move between floors. This was not a theoretical risk. It was a daily operational reality. The Sky Lobby elevator system was a genuine engineering achievement. Express elevators to transfer floors on 44 and 78. Local elevators serving specific floor ranges from there. Brilliant engineering. Alienating human experience. Workers arrived by express elevator, transferred, rode again. They spent their days on identical floors stacked one atop another. No variation in view. No variation in air. No variation in temperature. The Port Authority's own facility staff would eventually report that the buildings were among the most difficult structures they had managed. Every system was interdependent. A failure in one component cascaded through others. Critics who toured the finished towers before their public opening described the interior experience in similar terms. Oppressive. The sealed windows, designed to manage Yamasaki's own discomfort, cut thousands of workers off from the outside world entirely. No wind, no rain, no seasonal air. The columns that were meant to make the windows feel safer had the opposite effect on many occupants. Rather than feeling protected, they felt enclosed. The columns divided the view into narrow vertical strips. The sky, the harbor, the river, visible only in slivers. One architectural critic at the time described the towers as the world's most expensive filing cabinets, designed for storing people, not for allowing them to live. Yamasaki never publicly acknowledged these contradictions. In interviews, he discussed aesthetic refinements, the careful proportions, the play of light on aluminum surfaces. He presented the towers as a humanist achievement. Radio Row was never mentioned. The conditions inside the buildings were never discussed. The promotional materials showed well-dressed executives in pleasant offices with dramatic views. The reality? Hermetically sealed floors, narrowly barred windows, total mechanical dependency, was simply not part of the narrative. A building, in the end, is always a diagnosis. Yamasaki's towers diagnosed a particular illness. The belief that if you make something large enough, strong enough, tall enough, you can control everything inside it, including the people. But before those towers could rise, the ground beneath them had to be cleared, completely, permanently. And what happened to 13 blocks of Radio Row is something the Port Authority did not publicize, then or now. They did not haul it away. They did not truck it to New Jersey landfills. They pushed it into the Hudson River. Every brick, every broken beam, every pane of glass, from every shop on Oscar Nadell Street, pushed into the Hudson River. That was what happened to 13 blocks of Radio Row. The dumping created approximately 23 acres of new landfill extending Manhattan's shoreline westward. Battery Park City, the residential neighborhood that stands on that landfill today, is built on the physical remains of Radio Row. The neighborhood destroyed to make way for the towers literally became the foundation of another development. We found no plaque, no marker, no mention in the Battery Park City historical materials. The people who once worked in those buildings did not know this. Most of them still don't. Environmental regulations that would later prohibit such dumping did not exist in 1966. The Port Authority faced no legal obstacles. Progress required expedience. The rubble had to go somewhere. The river was convenient. Let us now be precise about the scale of what was erased. In the demolition, no archaeological survey was conducted. No systematic documentation of the buildings was undertaken. A few photographers captured images, but no comprehensive visual record exists of what Radio Row looked like in its final operating years. The neighborhood was erased from the physical landscape, and then it was erased from memory. Contemporary news coverage focused on the construction project beginning, not on the community that was ending. Articles described the ambitious engineering required to build the world's tallest towers. They profiled Minoru Yamasaki and his design vision. They explained the innovative structural system. Radio Row appeared only as a necessary clearing operation, if it was mentioned at all. The 5-year legal battle, the court filings, the public hearings, the families disrupted, reduced to a subordinate clause in a construction update. By December of 1966, most of the structures were gone. 13 blocks that had contained hundreds of buildings now stood empty except for piles of debris. Dust hung in the air constantly. Noise from jackhammers echoed through the surrounding streets for months. Salvage crews picked through the wreckage. Steel beams were cut apart and sold for scrap. Architectural details that might have been preserved were destroyed. Nothing of Radio Row was saved. The Port Authority issued a press release in March of 1966 to mark the beginning of demolition. It described the occasion as the groundbreaking for the most ambitious construction project in New York City's history. It did not describe what was being broken. David Rockefeller never publicly addressed what had been done to make the World Trade Center possible. No interviews, no acknowledgement of the neighborhood that was destroyed. His public statements focused on urban renewal, economic revitalization, New York's future as a global city. The human cost was not mentioned. Austin Tobin similarly avoided the topic. Port Authority press releases celebrated the beginning of construction. They highlighted engineering challenges ahead, the jobs that would be created, the prestige the towers would bring to New York. The fact that the site had recently been occupied by 800 functioning businesses was treated as an irrelevant historical detail. Minoru Yamasaki said nothing about Radio Row in any public statement. He discussed his design philosophy, his concern for human scale, his hope that the buildings would inspire and uplift. He said nothing about the people whose displacement made his towers possible. And the 30,000 workers received no compensation at all. The technicians, the salespeople, the delivery drivers, the apprentices who had been learning their trade on those floors. The Port Authority paid settlements to property owners and primary business operators. The workers themselves received nothing. No severance, no relocation assistance, no acknowledgement. They lost their jobs when their employers were forced out. They had to find work in an economy already shedding manufacturing and technical positions. The ripple effects spread through families and communities in ways that no city agency tracked. Mortgages couldn't be paid. Children's education plans were disrupted. Retirements were delayed. The African American and immigrant communities that had found economic footing through Radio Row were hit the hardest. The neighborhood had been one of the few places in the 1960s New York where technical skill mattered more than surname or skin color. Shop owners hired based on ability. The ability to repair electronics, knowledge of components, reliability with customers. The electronics district had provided economic mobility for people who faced discrimination everywhere else. That mobility was removed. Permanently, without discussion, without compensation, without acknowledgement that it had ever existed. The scattered businesses that relocated to other parts of Manhattan couldn't recreate the clustering effect. The knowledge ecosystem, the ability for a young technician to move from shop to shop, learning different specializations, no longer existed. It had been physically dispersed, spread across 5 boroughs, diluted to the point of dissolution. Those opportunities, once gone, did not come back. In the demolished debris now resting at the bottom of the Hudson River, The inventory of Oscar Nadel's shop, the shelves of vacuum tubes his father had sourced from manufacturers who no longer existed, the workshop equipment of 100 repair shops, the tools of 100 skilled technicians, the customer files, the supplier contacts, the accumulated knowledge of 50 years of electronics commerce. All of it pushed into the river, and on top of it, eventually, a luxury residential neighborhood where one-bedroom apartments now sell for $2 million. The neighborhood destroyed to build Rockefeller's towers became the most valuable piece of real estate his project created. He just didn't own it. Nobody who ever worked in Radio Row owned it. It was built, it was sold, and the people whose neighborhood it had been were not invited to the opening. They were the foundation, literally. The wrecking crews and the excavation engineers were working the same ground at the same time. While Radio Row came down above, something unprecedented was being attempted below, and the Port Authority spent decades not discussing how close it came to failing. August 1966, Lower Manhattan. The demolition crews are still working in the northern blocks, and the excavation engineers are already starting on the south end of the site. The problem they face is this. The towers need foundations anchored in bedrock. Bedrock in Lower Manhattan sits 70 feet below street level, beneath layers of soil, sand, fill, and the accumulated centuries of a city built on an island. 300 feet to the west, the Hudson River. Traditional excavation methods won't work. Dig a massive pit that close to the river and groundwater seeps through the soil walls. The excavation becomes a lake. The engineers needed a method never used at this scale on American soil. They chose the slurry wall. The technique had been developed in Europe for smaller projects. The theory, dig a trench around the perimeter of the site. As you dig, fill the trench with a mixture of water and bentonite clay. The slurry, dense enough to prevent the walls from collapsing, holds the trench open. Once the trench reaches bedrock, lower steel reinforcement cages into the slurry, then pump in concrete. The concrete displaces the slurry, hardens, and leaves a permanent underground wall anchored in bedrock. 3 feet thick, 70 feet deep, a continuous waterproof barrier around the entire 16-acre site. Construction of the slurry wall began in early 1967. Specialized equipment was brought from Europe. The American construction industry had nothing capable of this. Workers excavated the perimeter trench in sections, each about 20 feet long. Slow, precise. Any mistake in the slurry mixture, any gap in the concrete, any section that failed to bond to bedrock, and the entire project was in danger. Now let us go into the file that was not in the press releases. Port Authority engineering correspondence from 1967 and 1968 describes 2 critical incidents during slurry wall construction. In the first incident, January 1967, a night shift, a section of trench wall showed lateral movement. The ground between the trench and the river was shifting, not catastrophically, but measurably. The section was reinforced and re-poured. No announcement, no press coverage. Work continued. In the second incident, August 1968, during interior excavation, inspectors found water seeping through a joint between 2 slurry wall sections at the 50-foot level. Not a gush, a seep, but 50 feet below street level, 300 feet from the Hudson River. They sealed it overnight. They did not shut down the site. They did not issue a public statement. By morning, work continued. Now, this is not a conspiracy. Engineers encounter problems and solve them. That is what engineers do. The slurry wall ultimately succeeded. It held. It still holds. The foundation of One World Trade Center rests on it today. But here is what those 2 incidents reveal. The engineers were operating at the absolute edge of known methods. In a geological environment, they were learning in real time. The public narrative was confident mastery. The private correspondence was controlled uncertainty. There is a difference between those things, and nobody outside the Port Authority was given access to the second version. Now let us open the second ledger, the human ledger. The Port Authority's official safety records acknowledge that construction fatalities occurred. The first recorded death, January 1970, Carl Coe, iron worker, 36 years old, fell from the 44th floor. He left behind a wife and children. The Port Authority issued a statement about safety protocols. Work continued the next day. The exact total number of deaths during construction has never been definitively established. Port Authority records are incomplete. Workers who sustained injuries on site and died in hospital days or weeks later may not have been recorded in construction fatalities. Estimates range from 6 deaths to more than 12, depending on which incidents are included. Each death was a family destroyed. Now let us do the arithmetic the Port Authority never publicized. The iron workers who built the Twin Towers belonged to Local 40, the International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Iron Workers, New York City. The union's standard wage scale for iron workers in 1970, approximately $12 per hour. $12 an hour. In 1970, that is roughly $95 an hour in today's money, which sounds, presented that way, like reasonable compensation, until you understand what those $12 were paying for. The ironworkers guided prefabricated steel column units into position. Each unit weighed 22 tons, at heights no construction project in the United States had previously reached. At the 80th floor, wind conditions were unpredictable. Manhattan's position at the confluence of rivers creates gusts that do not behave the way textbook wind models predict. Safety equipment in 1970 was primitive by any modern standard. Harness systems were simple. Fall arrest technology was limited. The occupation of ironworker on a super-tall skyscraper was among the most dangerous in industrial work. OSHA, which didn't yet exist in its modern form, would later confirm that in retrospect. The risk was not theoretical. The risk was measured in the men who did not come home. The families of workers who died received death benefits from union insurance, not from the Port Authority, not from the Rockefeller interests. The Port Authority's liability was managed through standard workers' compensation frameworks. The compensation was finite. The loss was permanent. The towers took 7 years to complete. The construction workforce numbered in the thousands at peak activity. Tens of thousands of workers passed through the site between 1967 and 1973. Their names are not on the towers. Their wages are not inscribed anywhere. Their risk is not quantified in any commemorative document. At the 1973 dedication ceremony, Governor Rockefeller spoke about vision and achievement. Port Authority commissioners gave speeches about transformation. Minoru Yamasaki attended. The iron workers were not mentioned. The radio row workers were not mentioned. The engineers who sealed the Slurry wall joint at 50 feet below the Hudson River at 2 a.m, they were not mentioned. The $900 million final cost was celebrated as proof of ambition. Roughly $7 billion in today's money. Every dollar of that was borrowed against future revenues that, as we are about to see, were very slow to materialize. The towers were complete, the tallest buildings in the world, and almost nobody wanted to rent space in them. The towers opened in 1973 to a crisis nobody had publicly acknowledged was coming. The financial audit of what followed is, in many ways, the most damning document in this entire file. The official dedication ceremony for the World Trade Center took place on April 4, 1973. Dignitaries gathered, speeches were made. The narrative was triumph. The towers were the tallest in the world. Each rose 1,368 feet above street level. They had surpassed the Empire State Building by more than 100 feet. History, in the telling of it that day, had been edited. Radio Row was not mentioned. The 800 businesses destroyed were absent from the speeches. The 30,000 jobs lost received no acknowledgement. The families disrupted so the towers could rise were invisible at the celebration. But the towers themselves were about to deliver the most honest statement of the entire project. They were complete. They were the tallest in the world, and almost nobody wanted to rent space in them. The World Trade Center opened with a fundamental problem. The towers contained approximately 10 million square feet of office space, more office space than existed in many entire American cities. Finding enough tenants to fill that space in a market already oversupplied would be difficult. Finding tenants willing to pay premium rents for an unfashionable address in a neighborhood that shut down after dark, nearly impossible. Lower Manhattan in the early 1970s was not where prestigious corporations wanted to be. Midtown had become the center of corporate New York. Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, Madison Avenue. Those were the addresses that conveyed status. The World Trade Center had a second problem. The location was isolated. Subway access was limited compared to Midtown. The neighborhood went dead after 6 o'clock. Few restaurants, no cultural attractions, minimal retail. Employees who worked in the towers would spend their days in a business district that felt abandoned once the markets closed. The Port Authority had commissioned studies predicting strong demand. These projections proved wildly optimistic. By mid-1973, occupancy rates were dismal. The Port Authority itself occupied substantial space, effectively renting from itself to avoid the embarrassment of completely empty floors. The New York state government leased multiple floors, a favor arranged by Governor Rockefeller. These government tenants accounted for a significant portion of occupied space. Private sector leasing was catastrophic. Major corporations showed no interest. The buildings that were supposed to restore Lower Manhattan's prestige were being rejected by the very companies they were meant to attract. Real estate brokers struggled to book tours. The financial implications were severe. The Port Authority had borrowed nearly $900 million to build the towers. That is roughly $7 billion in today's money. That debt needed to be serviced through rental income. With occupancy below 50% and climbing slowly, rental revenues fell far short of debt payments. The authority was covering the shortfall by diverting money from bridge and tunnel operations. Read that carefully. Bridge and tunnel tolls were being diverted, paid by commuters crossing the Hudson every morning, now going to subsidize empty office floors in a building constructed to serve Rockefeller's investment interests. We read those Port Authority ledgers. The same commuters who had never been asked, never consulted, never warned, now quietly paying for it every time they drove to work. Critics began calling the towers Rockefeller's folly. Architectural publications questioned Yamasaki's design. The closely spaced columns were described as oppressive. The plaza was windswept and unwelcoming. People avoided it. The observation deck on the South Tower's 110th floor opened in December of 1973. This provided one clear success. Tourists came. The views were spectacular. The deck generated revenue and created positive publicity. But tourist dollars couldn't cover empty office floors. The Port Authority needed corporate tenants. Those tenants weren't materializing. The 1973 oil crisis made everything worse. Energy prices soared. A building that consumed enormous amounts of power to run sealed climate control systems became dramatically more expensive to operate overnight. Corporations cut costs, deferred expansion plans. The last thing they wanted was expensive new office space in an inconvenient location. New York City itself was sliding toward fiscal catastrophe. Years of deficit spending, declining tax revenues, and generous union contracts had created an unsustainable financial situation. By 1975, the city was effectively bankrupt. Banks refused to extend additional credit. Emergency loans were eventually arranged, but the city entered a period of brutal austerity. Services were cut, employees laid off, infrastructure maintenance deferred, crime increased. This environment did nothing to help World Trade Center leasing. Companies weren't expanding in New York. They were leaving. The suburban migration that had started in the 1950s accelerated. The towers stood as monuments to a vision of urban renewal that the market was rejecting in real time. David Rockefeller's personal reputation suffered. He had championed the World Trade Center as the solution to Lower Manhattan's decline. Instead, it had consumed $900 million, roughly $7 billion today. It had destroyed a functioning business community. It had produced half-empty towers that drained Port Authority resources. Corporate headquarters continued clustering in Midtown. The financial district did not become the global trade hub envisioned. Gradually, reluctantly, the market shifted. By the late 1970s, occupancy began climbing, not through major corporate tenants, through smaller firms that needed space and found the reduced rents attractive. Government agencies expanded their presence. Financial services firms that couldn't afford Midtown addresses took floors in the World Trade Center. The buildings were filling, not with the prestigious international trade organizations that had justified the project, with ordinary businesses making pragmatic decisions about real estate costs. By 1980, occupancy had reached approximately 75%. The Port Authority was still subsidizing operations through bridge and tunnel revenues, but the losses had decreased. Optimists suggested the towers might eventually break even. The observation deck continued attracting tourists. Photography crews included the towers in New York skyline shots automatically. Films set in New York featured them as establishing shots. Popular culture was doing what Rockefeller's marketing department had failed to do, slowly transforming the towers from Rockefeller's folly into an accepted part of the urban landscape. But acceptance is not redemption. The towers existed because 800 small businesses had been destroyed. They were built with borrowed money secured against toll revenues that took more than a decade to be offset by rental income. The vision of Lower Manhattan renewal through prestige development had largely failed. David Rockefeller's memoirs, published decades later, would defend the World Trade Center as a successful urban renewal effort. The destroyed businesses, the displaced workers, the years of financial losses, all of it minimized, most of it omitted. The towers were standing, they were filling, and they were beginning to serve a function nobody had anticipated. They were becoming something nobody had planned for them to become. And the mechanism of that transformation was not architecture, not economics, and not government policy. It was culture. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s. The towers that had opened to mockery and empty floors were becoming woven into the fabric of New York. Not through careful planning, not through brilliant marketing, not through the international trade organizations that had justified seizing 800 businesses to build them. Through simple presence. They were there. They were enormous. And gradually people stopped seeing them as Rockefeller's mistake and started accepting them as part of the skyline. This transformation came from places nobody had planned for. Tourism arrived first. The observation deck on the 107th floor of the South Tower drew 2 million visitors annually within a few years of opening. Tourists from every country came to stand at that height and look down at the entire geography of New York Harbor. The restaurant on the North Tower's upper floors, Windows on the World, became one of the most famous dining rooms in America, not because of proximity to international trade, because of the view. From that altitude, Manhattan revealed its geography in ways that street-level life never could. The rivers, the boroughs, the harbor, the bridges. People celebrated anniversaries there. Business executives brought clients. The setting could not be replicated anywhere else. And it made money. Photography followed. Images of the Twin Towers began appearing on postcards, in guidebooks, in magazine spreads about New York. Directors shooting establishing shots of the city included the towers automatically. They were the most recognizable vertical elements in the skyline. When people around the world thought of New York, increasingly they pictured those two rectangular forms. Then came popular culture. In 1976, the remake of King Kong used the towers as its climax. The giant ape climbed the South Tower while helicopters circled. The sequence embedded the buildings in global cultural memory in ways no amount of Port Authority publicity could have achieved. By the mid-1980s, occupancy had reached 90%. The Port Authority was finally collecting enough rent to cover operating expenses and debt service. The financial disaster of the opening years had been overcome through persistence and market adjustment. Rents had been lowered to competitive levels. The tenant mix reflected this reality. Financial services firms occupied multiple floors. Law offices serving the financial industry clustered nearby. Government agencies continued leasing space. The international trade organizations that were supposed to anchor the complex were present, but not dominant. The towers were functioning as ordinary office buildings. The plaza between the towers developed its own rhythms. Office workers took lunch breaks there in decent weather. Street performers worked the crowds. The sculpture by Fritz Koenig, a large bronze sphere in the center, became a meeting point. The space was still windswept, still austere, but it was being used. By 2000, the World Trade Center had been standing for 27 years. An entire generation had grown up knowing those towers as permanent features. Children born after their opening had no memory of the neighborhood that preceded them. Radio Row existed only in archives and in the fading memories of people now in their 70s and 80s who had worked there. The Rockefeller family's role had receded from public consciousness. David Rockefeller was in his 80s. His brother Nelson had died in 1979. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had dissolved. The mechanisms that had cleared Radio Row belonged to a history that fewer and fewer people were following. The Port Authority continued operating the complex. Annual revenues exceeded $100 million. The buildings required constant maintenance, but they were finally profitable. Minoru Yamasaki had died in 1986. His towers had become his most famous work. Critics argued they represented a betrayal of his humanist principles. He never publicly addressed that contradiction. The towers stood as his legacy. Whether he was proud of them or burdened by them, he took to his grave. In February 1993, those questions became briefly irrelevant in the face of violence. A truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. 6 people died. 1,000 were injured. 50,000 workers evacuated down darkened stairwells. The bombing exposed vulnerabilities nobody had seriously considered. The towers were targets. Their symbolic status made them attractive to anyone wanting to strike at America. The height that made them spectacular also made evacuation extraordinarily difficult. Getting tens of thousands of people down 110 floors took hours. Security was enhanced, vehicle access restricted, barriers installed. Experts assured the public the towers were now safe. Life returned to normal. The 1990s brought peak success to the World Trade Center. Occupancy above 90%, rental income strong. The observation deck and windows on the world were profitable. The Port Authority had finally achieved the vision. 2 decades late. At a cost to the people of Radio Row that was never acknowledged, never compensated, never discussed. The towers had become beloved by many New Yorkers despite their controversial origins. Workers who spent their days in those buildings developed attachment to them. The views were extraordinary. The towers had become familiar. By 2000, Radio Row existed only in archives. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the site had no plaque, no acknowledgement, no presence in any historical marker on the grounds. Oscar Nadell and the other shop owners who had lost their life's work were absent from the historical narrative entirely. Then came the morning of September 11th. September 11th, 2001 was a clear morning. What happened next did not answer the questions Radio Row had raised. it buried them. At 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59, the North Tower at 10:28. 2,753 people died. The buildings that took 7 years to construct were gone in less than 2 hours. The attacks transformed the towers from controversial office buildings into sacred ground. The neighborhood destroyed to build them was forgotten entirely. The inadequate compensation paid to Radio Row business owners became irrelevant. The years of financial losses, the borrowed toll revenues, the empty floors, all of it disappeared from discussion. What mattered was the loss of life. The site became a memorial. The footprints where the towers had stood were preserved as reflecting pools. The names of the dead were inscribed on bronze panels. Visitors came to mourn, to remember, to pay respects. One World Trade Center opened in 2014, rising 1,776 feet, taller than the Twin Towers, designed to be resilient. Radio Row is not mentioned in any of the memorial materials. The 800 businesses destroyed to clear the site have no plaque, no acknowledgement, no mention anywhere on those grounds. Oscar Nadell and the other shop owners who lost their life's work are absent from the historical record entirely. David Rockefeller died in 2017 at age 101. Obituaries praised his philanthropy and business leadership. The World Trade Center was mentioned as one of his major achievements. The methods used to make it possible were not discussed. The question that Radio Row business owners raised in the 1960s remains unanswered. Does government have the right to seize private property from functioning businesses to build speculative real estate for other private interests? The courts said yes. The towers rose. They fell. Whether that authority should have been exercised is different from whether it could be. We have spent this video doing something different from telling you the story everyone tells. We audited it. We opened the court records from 1963. We calculated the wages of the iron workers who died building those towers. We mapped the blight designation back to the man whose real estate portfolio it protected. We followed the rubble of Radio Row to the bottom of the Hudson River and to the foundation of Battery Park City above it. None of that changes what happened on September 11th. None of it diminishes the grief at the memorial. But it demands that we hold two things at once. The towers were a monument to what power can build, and a monument to what power will destroy to do the building. What remains are questions about who decides what cities become, and whether magnificence can ever justify the means. We don't claim to know the answer. We claim only this: the answer deserves to be asked. With the full record in front of you, not the edited version. If this kind of investigation matters to you, please leave a comment below. Tell us what you found most surprising. And subscribe, because next time we are going into a building, one whose owner was told by a court, a doctor, the laws of physics, that it could not exist. She built it anyway, for 38 years. That story is next.